They found the plane in 1989, buried under 40 feet of Norwegian snow. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's frozen hand was still gripping the control stick. His logbook lay open on his lap. The last entry read, "Mission confirmed. Coordinates received. No one is answering." The date was March 14th, 1945. But here's what made investigators go cold. When they checked the military archives, there was no record of this mission. No orders, no coordinates, no flight plan. It was as if someone had sent 10 men to die and then erased every trace that they ever existed. His name was Captain James Holloway, 26 years old, a bomber pilot from Ohio with 73 missions under his belt. The kind of guy who never questioned orders, never hesitated, never looked back. That's what the war wanted. Men who flew into the dark without asking why. And on that freezing March morning, Holloway and his crew did exactly that. They climbed into their B-17, engines roaring to life in the pre-dawn mist, and took off from an airbase in southern England. The ground crew watched them disappear into the clouds. No one waved, no one cheered. It felt wrong, one mechanic would later say, like watching ghosts. The briefing had been strange. Holloway remembered that. Usually mission briefings were loud, crowded, filled with dozens of crews getting their targets. But this one was private. Just him and his navigator, called into a small room with a single officer they'd never seen before. The man wore no name tag. He slid a sealed envelope across the table and told them the coordinates were inside. He said the mission was classified. He said it was critical. Then he left. Holloway looked at his navigator, a kid from Boston named Eddie Marsh, and saw the same confusion in his eyes. But orders were orders, so they flew. The first 2 hours were routine. They crossed the English Channel, skirted the Dutch coast, climbed to 20,000 feet. The sky was gray and endless. Inside the plane, the crew was quiet. Too quiet. The bombardier, a farm boy named Luca, kept checking his instruments like something was off. The radio operator, Stevens, kept trying to reach command. Nothing. Just static. Holloway told him to keep trying. He told himself it was normal. Radio silence happened. But deep down, in that place where fear lives before you name it, he knew. Something was wrong. They flew north. Farther north than any mission Holloway had ever flown. The coordinates took them over the Norwegian Sea, away from any known German positions, away from any strategic target. The fuel gauge was dropping. Marsh kept recalculating, kept looking at the map, kept shaking his head. He finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "These coordinates don't make sense. There's nothing out here." Holloway didn't answer. What could he say? That he agreed? That he was scared? That for the first time in 73 missions, he didn't trust the orders he'd been given? The weather turned. Snow began to fall, thick and blinding. Visibility dropped to nothing. Ice formed on the wings. The plane started to shudder. Holloway felt the controls go stiff in his hands. Behind him, he heard someone praying. He wanted to turn back. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But the orders had been clear. Deliver the payload, complete the mission. He thought about his wife, about the letter he'd written her the night before, about how he'd promised he'd come home. He thought about all the men who'd made that same promise and never kept it. Then the engines started to fail, one by one. The sound of them dying was like something human, like a scream cut short. Holloway fought the controls, but the plane was already falling. Through the snow, through the clouds, spinning toward a mountain range he couldn't see. The crew was shouting, but their voices seemed far away. In that moment, Holloway looked down at the sealed envelope still tucked in his jacket. He'd never opened it. He'd followed orders without ever knowing what they were. And now, plunging toward the earth, he realized the truth. They'd been sent to nowhere, on orders no one ever gave.
The investigation started small. A Norwegian hiker spotted a piece of metal sticking out of a glacier. Local authorities thought it was debris from a known crash. But when they pulled it free, they found something unexpected. An American bomber, almost perfectly preserved. And inside, 10 frozen men, still strapped into their seats. What made international news wasn't just the discovery. It was what came next. When the U.S. military was contacted, they had no file on this plane, no mission report, no casualty record. It was like the flight had never happened. But it had happened. The families proved that. When the names of the crew were released, a woman in Ohio came forward, Margaret Holloway. She was 81 years old. She had spent 44 years believing her husband died in combat, believing he was a hero, believing the telegram she'd received in April of 1945 that said he'd been killed in action over Germany. Except he wasn't over Germany. He was in Norway, on a mission that didn't exist. She brought letters, photographs, his wedding ring that had been mailed back to her. And she brought one more thing, a journal entry from the night before he disappeared. In it, James Holloway wrote, "Strange briefing today. Can't talk about it. But something feels off. If anything happens, know that I love you." The military opened a quiet investigation. Quiet because what they found didn't make sense. The orders that sent Holloway's crew north that day weren't in any official record, but they had existed. A retired clerk from the airbase came forward. He remembered typing the mission brief. He remembered the officer who delivered it, a man with no name tag, no identification, who appeared one day and vanished after the plane took off. The clerk had thought it was odd, but it was wartime. Odd things happened. People didn't ask questions. Investigators tracked down the sealed envelope. It had been fused to Holloway's jacket by ice and time. When they finally opened it, they found coordinates, exact coordinates, and a single line of instruction. Deliver payload, maintain radio silence, return to base. The problem was the payload. The plane's bomb bay was empty. Whatever they'd been carrying, it wasn't explosives. The bay had been modified, reinforced with strange metal plating, and there were burn marks inside, like something had been incinerated at extremely high temperatures. One investigator, a man who'd spent 30 years analyzing military crashes, said it looked like they'd been transporting something classified, something that had to be destroyed mid-flight. Theories emerged. Some believed it was a secret weapon test that went wrong, erased to avoid scandal. Others thought it was a mission to deliver intelligence to resistance fighters, a mission so sensitive it had to be buried. A few whispered about something darker, about experiments, about things the military didn't want anyone to know. But the truth, if it existed, stayed locked in classified vaults. The official report concluded that Holloway and his crew died in a navigational error, a tragic accident. The families were given medals, apologies, closure, or something like it. But Margaret Holloway never believed it. She kept digging. She hired private investigators, contacted journalists, wrote letters to congressmen. And in 1993, 4 years after the plane was found, she received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed her husband, young and smiling, standing beside the B-17 before his last mission. Written on the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 8 words. He knew too much. They made sure he didn't return. She died 6 months later. Heart failure, the doctors said. But her daughter, who'd watched her mother search for answers for decades, believed it was something else. A broken heart. The kind that comes from knowing your husband died not for his country, but because of it. The photograph was never authenticated. The handwriting was never traced. And the story of Captain James Holloway and his crew faded back into the shadows where it had always belonged. Today, the wreckage of the B-17 sits in a Norwegian aviation museum. Visitors walk past it every day, reading a small plaque that tells the official story. A navigational error, a tragic accident, 10 brave men who died serving their country. But sometimes, late at night, when the museum is empty, the guards say they hear something. The sound of engines, distant and fading, like a plane still searching for a mission that never existed, still flying toward coordinates that led to nowhere. Some stories don't end. They just disappear into the static. And maybe that's what they were always meant to do.